The quiet frustration you feel when nothing seems to move, despite all the effort you have made internally, is not a coincidence, nor is it a personal failure. It is the silent space where many people arrive after trying affirmations, visualizations, prayers, and techniques, only to realize that something subtle is still misaligned. There is a particular exhaustion that comes from doing everything right on the surface, while sensing deep inside that life is not responding in the way it should. This exhaustion is not spiritual weakness. It is a signal that the way you are asking, hoping, and intending may be working against you without you realizing it. Most people believe that manifestation fails because they lack faith, discipline, or positive thinking. Yet the truth is more uncomfortable, and at the same time more liberating. The real block often has nothing to do with what you want, and everything to do with the internal state from which you are asking. When desire is mixed with urgency, fear, or the need to be rescued from pain, the request itself carries tension. And tension, even when wrapped in spiritual language, communicates something very different from trust, coherence, and alignment. What few are willing to say is that many requests are not expressions of creation, but expressions of survival. They are shaped by old emotional patterns, nervous system conditioning, and unconscious beliefs formed long before the desire itself appeared. In these moments, you are not truly asking for a new reality. You are asking for relief from the discomfort of the present one. This distinction changes everything. In this video, you are not invited to believe harder, visualize longer, or repeat words with more intensity. You are invited to see clearly, to understand the hidden error that quietly blocks manifestation, not as punishment, but as protection that has outlived its purpose. And more importantly, you are invited to learn how to correct it now, not by force, but by alignment. The anatomy of asking the wrong way. At the surface level, asking appears simple. A thought forms, a desire takes shape, words are spoken internally or out loud, and hope follows. Yet beneath this apparent simplicity lies a complex interaction between memory, emotion, biology, and identity. What most people experience as asking is not a neutral act. It is a signal generated by the entire system, not just the conscious mind. And when that system is organized around tension, the request itself carries a hidden contradiction. Many requests are born from a sense of lack that has been rehearsed for years. The mind says, "I want change," while the body quietly says, "I am not safe without control." This internal split matters more than any technique, because the body does not respond to intention the way the mind imagines it does. The body responds to patterns. It responds to what is familiar, what has been repeated, and what has historically kept you functional, even if that functionality came at the cost of fulfillment. There is a subtle difference between desire and urgency. Desire is expansive. It allows space for possibility. Urgency is constrictive. It collapses the future into a demand. When a request is fueled by urgency, it often carries an unspoken message. This must happen, or I will not be okay. That message does not disappear just because it is not verbalized. It lives in muscle tension, in shallow breathing, in constant mental checking, in the inability to rest without guilt. Even moments of silence become charged, as if something important is being missed. The nervous system plays a decisive role here. A system trained by stress, unpredictability, or emotional instability learns to equate safety with vigilance. In this state, relaxation feels unfamiliar, and unfamiliar often feels dangerous. As a result, when a person tries to ask for something new, the body interprets the unknown as a threat. The request becomes internally paired with resistance, not resistance in the form of conscious doubt, but resistance in the form of physiological contraction. This is why so many people feel tired after manifesting. Instead of feeling open or grounded, they feel tense, alert, and restless. They check for signs, replay scenarios, analyze timing, and measure outcomes. The request has not produced peace, it has produced monitoring. And monitoring is not trust. Monitoring is the mind trying to manage uncertainty because the body does not feel safe surrendering control. Another layer of the problem emerges in the emotional tone behind the request. When asking is driven by comparison, frustration, or a quiet sense of being left behind, it reinforces the identity of someone who is waiting. Waiting becomes a role. Over time, The person no longer notices that they are organizing their days around anticipation rather than participation. Life feels like something happening elsewhere, to others, while they remain in preparation mode. This preparation mode is deceptive because it feels responsible, it feels mature, it feels like patience. But often it is avoidance disguised as readiness. Avoidance of disappointment, avoidance of vulnerability, avoidance of stepping into a version of oneself that has not yet been tested. The request then becomes a way to postpone engagement with the present moment. Instead of asking as an act of alignment, the person asks as a way to escape what feels unfinished inside. The body recognizes this escape immediately. It tightens, it speeds up, it refuses to settle. Even moments meant for reflection become filled with inner dialogue. This is not a failure of discipline. It is the consequence of asking from a place of internal pressure rather than internal coherence. Pressure always seeks relief. Coherence allows transformation. When a request is pressured, it seeks immediate resolution. When it is coherent, it allows unfolding. This difference is not philosophical. It is experiential. A pressured request feels heavy. A coherent request feels grounded, even before anything changes externally. Many people misunderstand this point and assume that strong emotion is required for results. They equate intensity with effectiveness, but intensity rooted in fear amplifies instability, not creation. The system becomes louder, not clearer. What actually supports change is not emotional volume, but emotional congruence. A calm certainty carries more structural power than a desperate plea. There is also the illusion of control that accompanies asking the wrong way. The person believes they are being proactive, yet their attention is consumed by outcome management. They attempt to predict, adjust, correct, and optimize every internal state. This creates an exhausting feedback loop where the individual becomes both the requester and the inspector of the request. Nothing is allowed to simply exist. Everything must be evaluated. Over time, this erodes trust, not in the universe or in life, but in oneself. The person begins to doubt their own internal signals. They no longer know whether a feeling is intuition or anxiety, whether a pause is guidance or avoidance. The inner landscape becomes noisy, and in noise, clarity cannot survive. Asking the wrong way is not about incorrect wording or insufficient belief. It is about the emotional posture from which the request is made. When the posture is defensive, the request becomes a shield. When the posture is coherent, the request becomes a bridge. Understanding this is not meant to create self-criticism. On the contrary, it offers relief. It explains why effort alone has not worked. It reframes the problem from "I am doing it wrong" to "I have been asking from a system that learned to survive before it learned to trust." Survival strategies are not mistakes. They are adaptations. But adaptations that once protected can later restrict. This chapter is not about fixing yourself, it is about recognizing the internal conditions under which asking becomes ineffective. When those conditions are seen clearly, the pressure begins to dissolve. And in that dissolution, something unexpected happens. The request no longer feels like a demand placed on life. It begins to feel like a natural extension of who you are becoming. When the mind asks for change but the body repeats the past, there is a moment many people recognize but rarely articulate. A moment when the mind feels genuinely ready for change, yet something invisible keeps pulling life back into familiar patterns. This moment is often misunderstood as self-sabotage or lack of discipline, but its roots run deeper than conscious choice. What is happening is not resistance at the level of thought, but loyalty at the level of the body. The body, unlike the mind, does not respond to ideas. It responds to repetition, emotional chemistry, and what has proven predictable over time. The mind is capable of imagining futures the body has never experienced. It can conceptualize abundance, peace, love, and expansion with ease. The body, however, lives in the archive of the past. It remembers what stress felt like, what disappointment required, what vigilance once prevented. When the mind begins to ask for a new reality, the body quietly checks its records. If the new reality does not match what the body recognizes as safe, the system hesitates, contracts, or subtly redirects attention back to what is known. This is not a conscious refusal. It is a biological reflex. Emotional states that have been lived repeatedly become familiar chemical environments. Over time, familiarity is mistaken for identity. Anxiety becomes how I function. Tension becomes how I stay prepared. Emotional struggle becomes how I prove effort. When these states dominate daily life, they are no longer experienced as temporary conditions. They become the baseline, and the body will defend its baseline, even when that baseline is painful. In this context, asking for change creates an internal contradiction. The mind points forward, but the body pulls backward. The request is split. On one level, there is hope. On another, there is preservation of the familiar self. This split produces a specific kind of fatigue, the kind that comes from wanting something deeply while simultaneously bracing against it. The person feels as if they are moving and standing still at the same time. One of the most misunderstood aspects of manifestation is the role of emotional memory. Emotional memory is not recalled the way events are recalled. It is reenacted. A person does not remember anxiety, they live it again. They do not remember scarcity, they anticipate it. These emotional reenactments shape perception. They influence which opportunities feel accessible, which conversations feel risky, and which decisions feel justified. This is why repeating affirmations without emotional integration often feels hollow. The words aim at the future, but the emotional state remains anchored in the past. The body hears the words as noise, not instruction. It continues to operate from the chemistry it knows best. Over time, this creates a quiet disillusionment. The person begins to feel that nothing truly works, when in reality, the deeper system was never included in the change. Another layer of this dynamic appears in how people relate to time. When the body is conditioned by stress, time is experienced as pressure. There is always a sense of falling behind or needing to catch up. Even positive desires become deadlines. The future is not a space of possibility. It is a countdown. In this state, asking becomes entangled with impatience. The request carries an implicit fear of delay, and delay feels like threat. The body responds to this by tightening further. It increases alertness, reduces tolerance for uncertainty, and amplifies self-monitoring. The individual becomes hyper-aware of internal states, constantly scanning for signs of progress or failure. This internal surveillance drains energy and narrows perception. Life begins to feel small, repetitive, and heavy, not because opportunity is absent, but because attention is trapped in evaluation. What is rarely acknowledged is that the body does not need to be convinced to change. It needs to be shown consistency. Consistency of emotional state, consistency of response, consistency of presence. Without this, the body defaults to its learned patterns, and learned patterns are persuasive because they are familiar. There is also a subtle emotional payoff in remaining aligned with the past. Familiar suffering offers predictability. It provides a narrative the person knows how to navigate. Change, even positive change, threatens that narrative. It introduces uncertainty not only about outcomes, but about identity. Who am I if I am no longer struggling? Who am I if I am no longer waiting? These questions may not surface consciously, but they influence behavior quietly and persistently. This is why many people find themselves repeating cycles even after moments of insight. Insight alone does not rewire emotional memory. It illuminates, but it does not stabilize. Stability comes from experiencing new states often enough that they begin to feel normal. Until then, the body interprets them as temporary or unsafe. Asking for change without addressing this gap places the individual in a state of internal negotiation. They try to move forward while reassuring the past that nothing essential will be lost. This negotiation drains vitality. It turns desire into effort and effort into strain. Yet within this dynamic lies an important realization. The difficulty is not that change is impossible. The difficulty is that change asks for coherence across levels that rarely communicate consciously. When the mind, body, and emotional memory begin to align, asking no longer feels like reaching outward. It feels like stabilizing inward. In this alignment, the request loses its urgency. It no longer needs to be repeated compulsively or defended mentally. It becomes quieter, steadier, more embodied. The person may not even notice when the shift occurs, but something changes in how they move through their days. Decisions feel less charged. Waiting feels less personal. Silence feels less threatening. The body begins to loosen its grip on the past, not because it was forced to, but because it senses continuity rather than danger. The future stops feeling like an intrusion and starts feeling like an extension. And in that subtle shift, the act of asking transforms. It is no longer a plea made from tension. It becomes a signal sent from coherence. The unseen shadow that quietly rewrites every request. There is a dimension of the asking process that operates beneath intention, beneath discipline, and even beneath awareness. It is not hostile, yet it is powerful. It does not announce itself, yet it influences outcomes with remarkable precision. This dimension is the unconscious shadow, the part of the psyche that carries what was once felt as unsafe, unacceptable, or too costly to express. When this shadow remains unseen, it does not disappear. It negotiates silently with every desire that passes through consciousness. The shadow is often misunderstood as something dark or destructive. In truth, it is protective. It formed at moments when openness felt dangerous, when hope led to disappointment, or when expression led to loss. Over time, these moments crystallized into internal rules. Rules such as do not expect too much, do not stand out, do not relax before it is certain, or do not trust what has not been proven. These rules were not chosen intellectually. They were absorbed emotionally, encoded as survival wisdom. When a desire arises that contradicts these internal rules, the shadow responds, not by arguing, but by redirecting energy. The person may feel distracted, hesitant, or inexplicably tired when moving toward what they consciously want. They may reinterpret opportunities as threats, or minimize their own readiness. This redirection feels rational in the moment. It often comes with convincing explanations. But beneath the logic is an emotional memory, protecting the self from a familiar pain. This is why many people experience a strange paradox. They sincerely want change, yet feel uneasy when it begins to approach. The closer the possibility feels, the stronger the internal tension becomes. This tension is not failure. It is the shadow checking the cost. It asks silently, what will this require me to become? And what part of me might no longer fit if this happens? The shadow often attaches itself to identity. Identity is not just a description of who you are, it is a contract with the past. It defines what feels consistent, what feels loyal, and what feels safe. When someone has spent years being the responsible one, the struggler, the caretaker, or the one who waits, these roles become anchors. Even if they are painful, they offer coherence. Change threatens that coherence. In this context, asking for a new reality can feel like betrayal. Betrayal of family patterns, betrayal of old versions of the self, betrayal of narratives that once gave meaning to endurance. The shadow reacts not because the desire is wrong, but because it challenges an emotional lineage. It challenges the logic that once explained suffering. Another subtle function of the shadow is its relationship with worth. Many people unconsciously link worth to effort, struggle, or sacrifice. Ease feels undeserved, receiving feels suspicious. When a request implies a reality with less strain, the shadow intervenes to restore balance. It introduces doubt, delay, or self-criticism, not as punishment, but as a way to maintain internal fairness. If life has always been hard, something in the psyche believes it should remain so. This belief does not dissolve through positive thinking. It dissolves through recognition. When the shadow is seen, it loses the need to act covertly. When it is ignored, it governs from behind the scenes. Ignoring it leads to cycles of motivation, followed by collapse. Recognizing it creates space for integration. Integration does not mean eliminating the shadow. It means understanding its language. The shadow speaks through emotion rather than words. It communicates through discomfort, hesitation, and resistance. When these signals are interpreted as enemies, the internal conflict intensifies. When they are interpreted as information, the system relaxes. One of the reasons people struggle to recognize the shadow is that it often masquerades as intuition. The hesitation feels wise, the withdrawal feels prudent, the delay feels strategic, and sometimes it is. But other times, it is simply old fear wearing the costume of discernment. Distinguishing between the two requires emotional honesty, not spiritual sophistication. The shadow also influences how people imagine outcomes. Even when visualizing success, there is often a faint image of loss attached. Loss of connection, loss of belonging, loss of identity. These images are rarely examined, yet they shape emotional response. The request becomes ambivalent. It carries a yes and a no simultaneously. This ambivalence drains momentum. It fragments attention. The person feels scattered, inconsistent, or conflicted without understanding why. They may blame circumstances or timing, but the real negotiation is internal. The shadow is asking for reassurance, not eradication. When the shadow is acknowledged, something softens. The request no longer needs to overpower internal resistance. It becomes quieter, more grounded. The individual no longer asks to escape who they are, but to expand it. This subtle shift changes the emotional tone of the desire. It is no longer driven by rejection of the present self, but by inclusion of the whole self. In this state, asking stops being performative. It stops being a strategy. It becomes an expression of coherence. The shadow, once integrated, no longer needs to interfere. It no longer has to protect against imagined threats. It becomes an ally, offering depth, discernment, and emotional intelligence. The unseen shadow does not block manifestation out of malice. It blocks incoherence. It resists futures that feel disconnected from the emotional truth of the person asking. When that truth is honored, the resistance fades naturally. What remains is not blind optimism, but grounded openness. Not urgency, but readiness. The request no longer echoes with hidden fear. It resonates with internal agreement. And in that agreement, the act of asking transforms from a struggle into a quiet alignment with what is already beginning to take shape. When alignment replaces effort and the request becomes natural, there is a moment in the inner journey when effort quietly loses its authority, not because desire disappears, but because the system no longer needs to push against itself. This moment is subtle and easily overlooked, yet it marks a profound shift. The request stops feeling like something projected outward and begins to feel like something stabilizing inward. What changes is not the intensity of wanting, but the quality of presence behind it. Before this shift, asking often feels heavy. It carries expectation, monitoring, and emotional weight. After the shift, asking feels calmer, almost secondary. The individual no longer orbits around the request as if it were the center of life. Life itself regains centrality. The request becomes part of a broader internal order rather than a demand placed upon reality. This change does not occur through willpower. It occurs when coherence begins to replace conflict. Coherence is not perfection. It is consistency across inner layers. Thoughts, emotions, and bodily states begin to tell the same story. There is less internal debate, less contradiction between what is desired and what is feared. The system no longer sends mixed signals. One of the clearest signs of this alignment is the disappearance of urgency. Time no longer feels like an enemy. Delays no longer feel like personal rejection. Silence no longer feels threatening. This does not mean passivity or resignation. It means the nervous system has stopped interpreting uncertainty as danger. When danger is removed from the equation, clarity has room to emerge. Clarity changes how attention functions. Instead of scanning constantly for signs, the individual becomes more receptive to nuance. Subtle opportunities are noticed. Conversations feel more meaningful. Decisions feel less forced. There is a sense of participation rather than waiting. The person is no longer preparing for life. They are inside it. In this state, effort transforms. It becomes focused rather than frantic. Actions arise from understanding rather than pressure. The individual is no longer trying to prove readiness or worth. There is an internal permission to move without self-surveillance. This permission does not come from external validation. It comes from internal agreement. Internal agreement is the result of integration. The parts that once resisted are no longer ignored or overridden. They are included. Fear is acknowledged without being obeyed. Desire is honored without being inflated. The system begins to trust itself because it feels heard. Trust in this sense is not blind belief. It is the absence of internal opposition. When opposition dissolves, energy is freed. This energy does not necessarily feel euphoric. It often feels quiet, grounded, stable. There is less emotional volatility. Highs are less intoxicating, lows less destabilizing. This stability allows for sustained engagement with reality. It supports consistency over time. Another subtle shift occurs in how outcomes are imagined. Instead of fantasizing about escape or transformation as a rescue, the individual imagines continuity. The future feels connected to the present rather than separate from it. Growth feels like an extension, not a rupture. This continuity reassures the body. It no longer needs to defend against imagined loss. The relationship with identity also softens. The person is less attached to who they were and less anxious about who they must become. Identity becomes flexible rather than rigid. Roles loosen, narratives expand. There is space for contradiction without collapse. This flexibility is essential because rigid identities cannot adapt to new realities without friction. In this aligned state, the request no longer needs repetition. It does not need reinforcement through constant mental rehearsal. It exists as an orientation rather than a mantra. The individual may not even think about it daily, and paradoxically, this absence of fixation allows life to respond more fluidly. Life responds not to insistence, but to coherence. When internal signals are consistent, external responses tend to organize more smoothly. This is not mysticism, it is relational dynamics. Clear signals invite clear responses. Stable presence invites stable engagement. Conflicted energy invites confusion. One of the most liberating aspects of this shift is the release of self-blame. The individual no longer interprets every obstacle as personal failure. Challenges are seen as part of movement rather than proof of inadequacy. This perspective reduces emotional reactivity and preserves momentum. Setbacks no longer derail the entire process. There is also a deepening sense of self-respect, not the kind that depends on achievement, but the kind that comes from honoring internal truth. The person trusts their pacing, they respect their limits, they recognize when to pause without interpreting pause as weakness. This self-respect stabilizes intention. In this environment, asking becomes almost unnecessary, not because desire disappears, but because desire is already being lived in small, consistent ways. The request is embedded in daily choices, in how attention is allocated, in how boundaries are held, in how meaning is constructed. Life begins to reflect this embedding gradually, often in ways that feel natural rather than dramatic. What once felt like effort now feels like alignment. What once felt like waiting now feels like participation. The system no longer demands proof from the future to justify the present. The present is sufficient. This does not guarantee ease or eliminate challenge, but it changes the posture with which challenges are met. They are no longer interpreted as signs of misalignment, but as elements of process. The individual remains engaged rather than discouraged. When alignment replaces effort, the request loses its desperation. It becomes a quiet statement of direction, and direction, sustained over time, has a way of shaping reality without force. The system no longer needs to ask loudly. It is already moving in harmony with what it once sought. What becomes clear through everything explored here is that manifestation is not blocked by a lack of desire, intelligence, or spiritual effort. It is blocked when the inner system is asking for one thing while quietly preparing for another. The error has never been that you wanted too much or believed too little. The error was subtle, asking for change from a state that was still organized around protection, urgency, and emotional memory. When asking comes from tension, the request carries the past into the future. When asking comes from coherence, the future becomes an extension of the present rather than an escape from it. This shift is not dramatic. It does not announce itself with fireworks or instant transformation. It reveals itself through calm, through steadier attention, through the quiet sense that you no longer need to chase signs to feel secure. The most important realization is this: life does not respond to how strongly you ask, but to how consistently you are aligned with what you ask for. Alignment is not perfection. It is honesty between thought, emotion, and bodily state. It is the moment when the nervous system no longer feels threatened by the unknown, and the shadow no longer needs to interfere to preserve identity. When that internal agreement is established, the act of asking changes its nature. It stops being a demand placed on the universe and becomes a declaration of direction within yourself. From that place, action becomes cleaner, waiting becomes lighter, and outcomes no longer define your worth. You move forward not because you are forcing reality to respond, but because your inner world has stopped contradicting itself. The correction was never about adding more techniques. It was about removing internal conflict. And when conflict dissolves, clarity emerges naturally. From clarity, life reorganizes in ways that feel less miraculous and more inevitable. If your request were answered exactly as you are internally organized right now, would it truly give you peace? Or would it simply activate another cycle of tension? If this video brought clarity to something you have felt but could not name, subscribe to the channel so you stay connected to deeper conversations like this one. And continue watching the next video on the final screen, where this understanding is expanded into how alignment shapes real-world decisions, relationships, and outcomes over time.